and relentlessly paced. Prom Mom is, for my money, an instant classic with a cast of characters real enough to leap stage and haunt your dreams, especially my new hero, Amber Glass. A truly unforgettable read. Sarah Pekkanen is the #1 New York Times bestselling co-author of several novels of suspense, including An Anonymous Girl and The Wife Between Us, and the internationally and USA Today bestselling author of over half a dozen solo novels. A former investigative journalist and award-winning feature writer, her work has been published in numerous national magazines and newspapers. She lives just outside of Washington, D.C. with her family. We're honored to welcome Laura and Sarah to Harrisburg for the first time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hey, Sarah.
Reunited again.
I think we should start by telling our backstory, which I don't think most people know. Sarah and I worked together in the Baltimore Sun Features Department back in the 1990s. I left the paper in 2001, and I was already writing at that time. When did you leave newspapers?
So I started at the Sun in 98 and I left in 99. But not only did we write features together, we actually sat as close as we are now.
That's true. Yeah. We were just basically colleagues in the same newsroom. And I think this is actually kind of a cool ending.
And the thing that I finally confessed to Laura the other day in an email was that she really inspired me, because Laura would, stroll into the Baltimore Sun kind of like, glowing with health and with productivity. I thought, so she corrected me tonight, I thought she'd gotten up at like some ungodly hour to row because that's what she did. Like she would go out and row on the river, and then she'd go to a coffee shop and write a few chapters, and then she'd come to work, like at the time that I was straggling in, and she would do a full day's work. She since corrected me that she only either wrote or rode. It wasn't both.
Yeah,
so
I didn't do both at the same time. And I like to quote Captain Hammer. I remember it differently, but so unlike me, you've written in other genres. So I'm going to start off by asking you, what brought you to the dark side of crime, which is when you started. I think you started with, maybe in your first set of solo books, you kind of started edging that way, but it was really when you were co-authoring those books with Greer that you went full out as a crime writer, right? What brought you over?
I feel like it might have been my children. Is that
because you wanted to murder them?
No, I mean, I was edging toward that, and I'm drawn to reading thrillers. I've always been drawn to that. Like I read Baltimore Blues, Laura's, first, I guess it was more of a mystery, but before I even started working at the Sun, and it was just, I loved both genres. So I, initially started in what used to be called women's fiction. Now, rightly, it's just called fiction. We don't call it men's fiction. It's but my books were more along the lines of like a Jennifer Weiner, Taylor Jenkins Reid. And then I started, adding a little bit of like mayhem and murder toward, the last few before making the leap into writing thrillers. And I had a good chance to make that break. A lot of times we authors have contracts that state you have to write in this particular genre. You have to write X number of words, roughly, but also in this genre, because readers come to expect it. You don't want to go pick up a book that you think is going to be a thriller and find out it's, a romance. If it's kind of disconcerting. So when I left my old publisher and began to co-write, I made the full jump into thrillers and just discovered I really loved it. I think, I don't know if it's like a reporting background, like putting together pieces of a story that's so appealing to me, but there's something about the architecture of a thriller that I found challenging and fascinating.
I know that for me, I always wanted to write novels. Like in my 20s, I wanted to write novels, but I felt lucky just I had a job writing at newspapers. but fiction was always the goal. I'd done better in my creative writing classes than in my journalism classes at Northwestern. And I think one of the things that, do we have people here tonight who aspire to write? Yeah, good. So I think like this one really weird, obvious clue is you should probably write what you love to read. And I loved James Cain, and I loved Raymond Chandler. And I had a professor at Northwestern named Stuart Kaminsky, who actually wrote a really interesting private eye series about a guy named Toby, who was a private eye in Hollywood. And Kaminsky, who was a film professor, drew on his knowledge of film scholarship to write these really, like there's one, I think it's called Murder on the Yellow Brick Road. And it begins with a person of short stature murdered on the set of the Wizard of Oz. Like, you know, there's a munchkin with a knife through, and it's like, but I really do think that it's so odd. Well, first of all, I teach writing in a couple of places, and every now and then I have a student who doesn't read. And I'm like, okay, that's a no-go. Like, you know, you can't be a writer if you're not a reader. That's the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in my life. But it's also that people are not always in touch with the idea that if you love reading something, that's probably what you should be writing. So, and I mean, I'm sure you loved all the things you're writing. 'Cause I love no longer women's fiction too. I like novels that are driven by women's stories. I always have. And I love crime fiction. There's some genres I should be better at it. And because I like all genres. And I think one of the interesting things about being a genre writer is it makes you a lot less hierarchical, or it should, because crime is the genre that mainstream literary fiction almost kind of is okay with. And they're so vicious to romance writers. And so yeah. So how many books have you written by now? It's a lot.
This is number 13. Lucky number
Lucky 13.
13.
Yeah.
What number is this for you?
Well, technically it's 29, but that includes a children's book that I literally wrote in an hour, and a book of essays and 2 books of short stories. So I guess that makes this my 26th novel, and I started publishing in 97. So I have been kind of hitting the, which is confusing because I don't, that number seems wrong to me. I'm gonna have to go back and count again, but 20 something. I just put it there.
We're not math majors, we're writers. So I've got a question for you. So what was it? I mean, you were working as a journalist, you were writing all day long. What was it that made you start to write a book?
Well, it was a mean editor. Because, so this is before Sarah's time at the Baltimore Sun. When I joined the Sun, it was 1989, and there were 2 completely separate newspapers, the Sun, which was the morning newspaper, and the Evening Sun. And I was hired to be on the Evening Sun, and the only thing they shared was the photo department. There was no overlap. And then in the early 90s, they collapsed the 2 staffs. They got rid of a lot of people through a very lucrative buyout. And then those of us who worked at the Evening Sun were now working for bosses at the Sun who didn't know us, who didn't hire us, and weren't particularly fond of us. And one of those bosses called me in one day to sort of read me the riot act about something. And I was like, no, I mean, I said I had issues with the editor who had assigned, and I said, look, you know, I'm better than this. Y'all are giving me terrible assignments. And he said, you're just not a good writer. And I thought about that. And, you know, I'm going to tell you, I kind of liked it because it wasn't passive aggressive. And so many of the bosses at the Sun were passive aggressive, or they said things behind your back. So I kind of liked the in your face style to it. So I walked out of his office thinking, he's my boss. I mean, writing is subjective. I think I'm a good writer, but he just told me to my face I'm not a good writer. And he's my boss, and I can't change that in the short run. But if I wrote a book and actually published it, then more people would get to weigh in on whether I was a good writer or not. So that was really where it started. What inspired your first book?
I mean, that, first of all, is amazing. I feel like a lot of reporters would kind of curl up and cry a little bit at being told, Laura's like, I'm just going to write a book. All right. Wow. No, for my first one, so I had, as we've talked about, we were working at the Sun. I got pregnant with my first of 3 sons. And, I always, I loved writing. It was what I had always wanted to do from the time I was a kid. I used to write novels and like send them out to publishers as a little girl. Loved working for the Sun. And then I had my first of 3 sons. My oldest son had some, mild disabilities, and I was unable to be with him and still work at the Sun, which was 45 minutes away from my home, and would occasionally require like staying late at night or getting on a plane and going somewhere. So I ended up staying home, and I stopped writing altogether for a couple of years, and I really, really missed it. I think I became a little bit depressed. I felt like, I always describe it as like your best friend moving away out abruptly and you lose contact. It was just this thing that was gone. And so when I took a glass of wine up to my computer for courage, and Hemingway did it. What the hell? We can do it. And I started writing, and I worked really hard on this book for 3 years. Like any minute I had, my kids never slept. But like, if they ever slept in the car for 10 minutes, I had like a notebook, in the side pocket. And, I don't even think I went to the dentist for like 2 years because I was like, I have to get every pocket of time for writing. And at the end of 3 years, I got an agent. I was so excited. I wrote a magazine cover story for Bethesda magazine on the fact that I'd gotten an agent and was about to break through as a novelist. And every single publisher in New York turned down my book. And so I was like, oh God, I cannot even go to the grocery store. Like I'm going to see people I know. Like it's so humiliating. So I'm like, the only thing to do was to write another one, like, as well as I could. And I did. And that one got published. And ever since then, I've had 1 year. So maybe there is a little bit of that, like.
And the agent stuck with you, right?
The agent stuck with me. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think your agent is Victoria. Did I have that right?
Victoria Sanders was my agent for a long time. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a new agent now?
So when Greer and I joined forces, she had not gotten to pick her agent, so we moved to Margaret Riley King at William Morris as a duo.
Okay, that makes sense. Wow. Yeah. So this is a thing. It's really interesting. I just recently read a book called Monster by Claire Detterer, which is fantastic. And there's apparently this very, very famous essay. I think it's by Cyril Connolly. I might be screwing that part up, but it talks about how if you're a parent, you can't be a very good novelist. And he invokes what he calls the pram in the hallway. And, Detterer kind of explores that. And then Detterer takes it and turns it on its head and says, as a female writer, she worries that what if I'm not a big enough monster? This idea, I have such strong opinions about the idea that you can't be a good writer and a good parent. Because that is something that's out there. That people, I'm actually, John Banville, famous, John Banville, Booker reader, Booker winner who writes under pseudonym when he writes crime novels, Benjamin Black. He, in an interview within the past 10 years to the Irish Times, just basically said, if you're a good writer, you're not a good parent. Let's bounce that idea around. I'm going to think that you think you're probably a good writer and a good parent, maybe, I hope.
I some days I would tell you I'm not a good writer because part of what goes along with our job description is self-doubt and mean girl voices in our head and all of that. I think that, in terms of being a good parent, I'm sure I have messed up in countless ways, but I really love my kids and I try. And so I think that does make me a good parent. I don't always get it right, but I adore them.
So I'm a little bit of an unusual case in that I started writing, I started publishing, I was in my 30s, and then I was in a relationship, I was in my 40s, and the man who had become my second husband really, really wanted to have a kid. And I would sort of look around and say, like, okay, let me talk to all of the successful writers I know who have small children. And there weren't any at the time. That changed a lot. At the time, though, in crime fiction, there were men who had kids and they had very supportive wives who did most of the child rearing. And I just could not find anyone who wrote while they had young children. There were women who stopped writing when they had young kids and then came back to it. There were amazing women like the late Margaret Maron who had started writing when her children were grown. But like looking for that role model, it wasn't there. But I mean, okay, first of all, you have to invoke privilege. I was someone who could afford really good childcare. I had a babysitter 35 hours a week. And that's a lot. I acknowledge that's a lot. And it really helped that I could afford that. But
You also have a husband who worked really long hours.
oh yeah, he was like, yeah, no, it was, yeah, he was like working, if it was a 12-hour day, that was like a good thing. So, but I feel like the kind of radical thing I want to say is I think being a writer, being a parent made me a better writer, which is not to say, oh, if you want to be a great writer, you have to be a parent. I'm just talking about my individual experience was having this small human who's gradually become larger, because apparently that's the thing they do. I felt like it opened my mind. I felt like it made me more empathetic, that I began seeing things through a lot of different lenses. I mean, I absolutely feel that the work I'm doing now is better than the work I did. And part of it is, I like to think, because I'm wiser and I've been doing it and there's practice. I think part of it too, oh, this is like a phenomenon we probably both observed at work. The moms were the most efficient people in the Sun newsroom. Yeah. They couldn't afford to stay late. They had kids to pick up. So they just worked really hard for the 9 hours we were there. And they worked, and then the rest of us just faffed around and we could kill time because we didn't have that deadline hanging over us. And I learned a lot from the women that we worked with who did have young kids when we were there.
Well, speaking of your best work now, want to talk a little bit about the plot of Prom Mom?
Just a little bit. The other day I was talking about it and I said, I can't really talk about what happens in this book beyond page 30. And someone came up to me during the signing and they challenged me and I said, is it literally page 30? And I said, okay, that's just a number I made up. Let me look. And I'm like, okay, it's page 32. That's the point. So really straight up, 20-ish years ago, girl convinced a boy who really didn't like her that much to take her to the prom. Once they were there, he saw his ex-girlfriend and began chasing after his ex-girlfriend. The date excuses herself because she's not feeling well. She ends up giving birth to a baby in a hotel bathroom, and the baby doesn't survive. Jump forward to 2019. This girl, now a woman who has not been in her hometown since she was released from a juvenile facility for this crime, returns home to settle up the estate of her stepfather. And against all logic is like, I'm gonna stay. And she's clearly still obsessed with her date, who is now a very happily married man. And everything emanates from that. So now you go with Gone Tonight.
Can I ask a question? If it's a spoiler, don't answer.
Okay.
But is the date now married to the girl who's
No,
chasing after it?
No, it's he is married to a woman he met in college who knows everything about him and actually like has devoted herself to him and to the idea that anyone can be good, you can be good. I mean, okay, so you dumped, yeah, and she's someone who's just sort of like she believes that they're just like the perfect couple. So Gone Tonight, which I know is a mother-daughter story.
So, so Gone Tonight, people like, you know, you get this question all the time too, I'm sure, like, are your characters ever inspired by real people? And mine never are. But there is a little piece of my main character in Gone Tonight who was inspired by my grandmother. So my grandmother dropped out of high school to help support her family, and she worked as a waitress her whole life into her 70s. And, you know, she never had much. She and her husband, who was an immigrant, built the house that they lived in. But when my dad was born, he had a serious heart defect and was told he would not live past his early 20s. So my grandmother, a woman who had no money, no connections, like nothing, found a surgeon several states away in Boston who was doing this new open heart transplant surgery in the early 1960s, convinced him to take my dad as a patient. My dad was operated on, and he is alive today at 83. Yeah, so that maternal ferocity of I will do anything to protect my kid. If there's a minivan that rolls over my kid, I'm going to find the strength to lift it up. If there is a wild animal coming at my kid, I'm going to jump between my kid and the animal. I wanted to tap into that instinct, which I felt, and I'm sure you felt at times, like that fierce love. But, you know, because I write thrillers, it you know, took kind of a different form. So Gone Tonight is a story of Ruth, a 42-year-old waitress who dropped out of high school and had her daughter, Catherine, who's now 24. And the two of them have only ever had each other. They're a complete family of two. Ruth keeps in touch with no one from her past. And she has some strange quirks. She conducts drills every now and then for 5 minutes, running through her apartment, seeing what she can take with her if she has 5 minutes to leave. She has to move every couple of years. And in fact, one of the areas that they live is right here. So I actually drove through and like picked out some landmarks to put in my novel. So they live here for a period of time toward the end of the book. And but Catherine is now 24, and she's like, you know, I want to have my own life. I just graduated college. I've got my nursing degree. I want to go and work at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. I've got a job offer. And Ruth will do anything to keep her daughter by her side. But what you don't know is if the danger is coming from Ruth or from Catherine or from the outside. There you go.
That's me. I want to say that, yes, I will do anything for my kid, but probably the most extreme thing I ever did for my kid was a fairly controversial. My kid had come home from a field trip, and her dad had been one of the chaperones on the field trip, and it apparently some really bad mean girl stuff had gone down. And you know, I was married to like one of the most famously hard-boiled guys in Baltimore, and the mean girls almost had him in tears, because we know, right, what the girls can do. And it was just bad, and I was so mad. And it had to have been 2018, because I know I was working on a book that was set in the 1960s that would be published the next year. So I tweeted out, "There's a mean girl at my daughter's school, and I want to kill her in a book. But her name won't in the 1960s historical novel, but watch out, kid, I play a long game." And I got called to the principal's office. I mean, I was like, wow, first time I'm getting called to the principal's office, and I'm in my 50s. And they were like, "Parents are very concerned about your tweets." And I'm like, what? Like, what? Like, they're worried that you're going to come to school and like get in the face of one. I was like, I would never do that. I mean, my belief is that I was too good at disguising the identity of the mean girl, because there were too many kids in my school, my sister's daughter's school, that frankly had kind of like, I mean, I'm just gonna, you know, they were kind of stripper names. And, they were all like trying to figure out, well, like, is it my kid? Is it my kid? Is it my kid? Because this is not a name that would have been used in the 1960s. But yeah, I couldn't lift a car off my kid, but I could tweet. That's what I did.
It's a principle for your kid. That's pretty great.
I know that people love this question. So tell me about your writing routine. How do you do it? What do you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we all love this question because we want to find the secret sauce. If there's something somebody's doing that's making it effortless, it's like, oh, I need to know that. And in fact, I've yet to find the answer, but my process changes depending on the book, whether or not I'm co-writing or not. The biggest difference if I'm writing solo versus with the co-author is that when you're writing alone, it's like the translation of thoughts towards your fingertips. And I will mutter to myself and walk around a lot because movement helps me think, but it's very solitary and internal. If I'm writing with somebody else, it is, you have to articulate. So there's like a middle step of brain, mouth, fingertips. And that's really hard to get. It was really frustrating for me at first to learn how to do that. But now when I'm back to solo writing, like the mechanics of the day are, I like to wake up really, really early and write. I used to love to sleep in, but tonight I would wake up at 4 or 5 and I run down to my couch. I have my little rescue dog with her 3.5 paws. She curls up next to me and I always get a coffee because we know, we need that in the morning or, can't live with ourselves. And I'll just write. And I think the couch makes it feel like the stakes aren't as high. Like I'm not in a fancy office. I'm not, I'm just like curled up with a blanket. And that's where I did my best writing for Gone Tonight. Recently I've experimented with writing in bed. And like, you know what? I'm like just like slowly, it's like couch to bed.
I can't even get the ergonomics. You're like on a laptop on the couch?
Some major wrist issues. So I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. Yeah.
Yeah. So before the pandemic, I used to work in coffee shops. And they reminded me of newsrooms. I like the cacophony and I loved it. And also early days, because I've been doing this for so long, early days, you couldn't sign on to your email or anything in a coffee shop. You just had to work. So I like that. Then the pandemic came along and I have an office around the corner, but I had an assistant and, to be safe, she was working out of there. I was working out of the house and I started working at my dining room table. And now I'm still at my dining room table. I've never gone back to my own office really to write. And I don't know why I like writing at my dining, but I've gone from loving the cacophony of a coffee shop to preferring to write in a house where no one else is present. It's not enough that they're not bothering me. It's like, no, I actually like the house to be empty. And I think part of the reason I don't work in my actual office is because my assistant is on the first floor and my office is on the 3rd floor. I feel self-conscious trying to write when there's another like breathing human being who has a connection to me. I can do it in front of strangers. So I think what we're kind of saying is there's like kind of some voodoo. Every writer has their own voodoo. Yeah.
It's muscle memory too. Like if you get some really good writing sessions at your dining room table, then like we get a little superstitious, or it's like your brain, thinks this is where I write. And as long as that's working.
I also appreciate the fact that you talked about the tactical quality. That's the word I want, right? That writing is tactical. And I was am a huge fan of the former New Yorker film critic, Pauline Kael. And Kael stopped writing in part because she had Parkinson's and she had a significant quiver in her hands. And people would say, well, use voice dictation, you could try this. And she said, I think I wrote as much with my hands as I ever did with my head. And that's really real to me. And I'm definitely a keyboard writer. I know a couple of people people younger than I am, who swear by longhand, which is just fascinating to me because if I wrote in longhand, I would never be able to get it would just take forever. And I don't, but yeah, I'm fast on a keyboard.
Well, and we came up in newspapers, so that's how we learned how to write. But when you were speaking about, the noises at the coffee shop being comforting, part of my first book I actually wrote at Chuck E. Cheese because I had two young
I
kids,
read about that.
right? And Chuck E. Cheese served beer, which you might need a beer when you have two young boys. So I would go there and I had like this whole system where I would have the tokens on a table and I would be able to watch my kids. And the rule was they had to come up every time they wanted a token, which was like every 5 seconds. So I'd eyeball them, I'd be typing, and it was loud, chaotic screaming, just like a newsroom. So it felt very comforting.
I mean, that's the thing too, is that if you want to do this, you're going to figure out a way to do this. We had a colleague, I'm not going to name him, but he came up to me and he was really bright and really talented. And he came up to me one day and said, I'd like to write a novel and I have this first line. And he said to the first line to me, I was like, it's really good. And he told me a little bit more about the idea. I'm like, I think it's great. You should write it. And he said, no, because if I try to write it, I probably won't finish it. And if I finish it, I probably won't find an agent. And if I find an agent, the agent probably won't sell it. And even if the agent sells it, it probably won't be a very big advance. And even if it gets published, it'll probably be very poorly reviewed. And it's like, wow, you just had a career. Like you just talked yourself out of it. And I do think that, it's not, there isn't that magic formula. We would both, that is, I have to admit, when you've been doing this for a while, kind of go pretty full Faust. Like if the devil appeared and said, I can make this easy for you, you might be like, how easy would it be? Let's talk. But everyone's looking for it, and it's really the most dreary. Show up and find out what works for you. Like, I'm sitting here like, I'm still trying to think about writing on the sofa. I barely sleep on the sofa. So, have you already started your next book?
So the next one after this one's done. That one's in copy editing right now. But yeah, so that one, because 1 a year schedule, like you got to turn them in like a year in advance, right? So I'm thinking about the one after that and kind of coming up blank. So how about you?
I have a book I'm going to try to finish by September 1st. I'm kind of interested. So Prom Mom these are not likable people, folks. I'm just going to tell you. I think they're interesting. I think they're very human. I think kind of the idea is that if you could peek inside the head of your neighbors, you might be really terrified what you find there. But so I spent basically 14 to 16 months during a pandemic with three people I really didn't like. And now I'm writing a book about like the most sweet, charming lady in the world. I just like, I have to flip it. And I have like, do you feel like, you've got these really distinct stages in you feel like there's something, is there a through line, especially in what you're doing now, since you're now back on your own again and kind of doing full throttle crime? Is there some kind of obsession, interest, theme?
Ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary circumstance and using their wits to get through it. And I think even at the Sun, I was drawn to that, whether it was like Columbine or, whatever it was. I always loved the story of somebody just living their ordinary life and like something happens externally that forces them to respond internally.
We're not doing capital V villains, right? I think that is something we have in common. And I like some of the capital V villain books. I like Thomas Harris. I like Hannibal Lecter. But that's not what I choose to write. I saw that we got the high sign to move to questions. So we're ready to move to questions now. Please have some. There's no question too ridiculous.
If anyone has a question, just raise your hand, bring the microphone over. You can ask the authors.
Hi, this is working. Yeah. Laura, I think I've read every single one of your, I don't know if you want to call them mysteries or crime novels, but I think I've read all of them. I love them. I lived in Baltimore for many, many years, and I still affiliate with the city. So I love the setting, and I love your sense of social geography and the different types of people and the way you get into their heads. And the plotting is wonderful. So I have a kind of silly question and then a serious question for both of you. The silly question is Tess ever coming back?
That's not a silly question. Tess, for those of you who might not know, was the main character in my first, not my first, but there's a series of 12 novels published between 1997 and 2015 that featured this female PI in Baltimore. And the last we saw her, she was married with a kid and it looked like they might be about to procreate again. I mean, like, it's literally the last thing that happens. And it was I thought I was so clever writing a female PI with a kid. And then I found out it's really hard to write about a female PI with a kid. So I kind of let Tess take a rest. She had a cameo in Dream Girl in 2021. And the book that I'm writing now is about a minor character in the Tess universe named Mrs. Blossom, who is a much older woman who came to work for her briefly and did surveillance. So I'm doing, I don't know if this will make sense. It's like a mashup between the film Charade and From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Bosley, Frank Weiler. Just try to wrap your head around that. I want Tess to come back, but there are two things that have to be true. One is I have to have the right story. It has to be a Tess story. Number two is I also now need to know the end of Tess's story as the books go. So it could be one more book, it could be three more books, but I'm not going to embark on it until I have the right stories and until I know how I want to end the Tess series. And in general, I'm really hands off with my TV film stuff. Right before the writer's strike, about 2 months before, I had a conversation with my film agent and said, I can't work on a TV show. I don't want to do that. It doesn't work for me. I know too much about it, but I want to write a pilot about Tess. I want to write what's called the Bible. I have an extremely specific concept for a Tess TV show, but I can't. And she's like, we need to basically fix you up with a showrunner. And we'd actually already started generating lists of people that I might work with. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for this. So Tess might end up on TV before she's back in print. Fingers crossed.
Watch television to see her. The more serious question is, and I know this just from reading a variety of mysteries, how do you structure a plot? You know, do you work it out ahead of time? Do you work out the clues, or how do you get it to fit all together? I'm not sure that's the best way to put it, but it always amazes me that these pieces fit together. How do you structure it? How do you create the structure?
How do you do it? Do you outline, or what's your?
So my process changed again, but these days what I do is I write a synopsis. It's about 5 pages and I send it to my editor. I hate writing a synopsis. I used to just kind of flail about within the book and, somehow it would work out. But I realized that by giving synopsis, I'm actually saving myself time. I'm making myself think through the book. And if there is, a book coming out with a similar theme, or if, my editor hates books about this particular topic, I would rather know that after a couple of weeks on a synopsis than 6 months of writing the book. So I'll write the synopsis and then I pretty much go from there. I generally don't outline beyond that, but what I love are my whiteboards. And I fantasize about having a room full of whiteboards, but I have 2 big ones. And so the top one, every time I finish a chapter, I'll write a line kind of summarizing what happened in that chapter. Like, Jan went to the store and bought a bagel. And then the bottom whiteboard is for all the stuff I'm throwing, like explore this theme and what about, tomatoes and, throwing random things on there. And what I liked about the top one is I can glance at it and just kind of see the architecture of the book, at the spine of it. And in a way to like reverse engineer, one of my favorite things to do is to take books I love or that are really compelling, and I go through them chapter by chapter with Post-its and write in this chapter, here's a quick line, put the Post-its up on the wall, and then I can see the outline of a really good book.
Wow. I kind of know the big secret. I know the big secret, and I'm working my way toward that. But I think part of what you have to remember is, I'm sure this is true of Sarah and me, we're doing so many drafts. So, Sarah does a synopsis, but then there's got to be more than one draft. You're not a one draft writer. I mean, there are some, like Cynthia Ozick is apparently one. But so I keep having discovery after discovery and refinement after refinement. And I feel like what we do is a lot like a magic act. There's a lot of misdirection. I know how to make you look at something in the scene so that you're not looking at the thing that's going to give things away. I know how to kind of misdirect your attention. I mean, I guess some people call that red herrings, but they're not necessarily red herrings. They're just not the thing that's going to, and I've always told myself that, if you're writing a straight up whodunit, there may be someone who figures it out by page 50, because people who read a lot of mysteries, and they're really smart. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about the person who figures it out. What I'm going to worry about is how do I keep that person reading? And what my hope is that that's what characters do. And I think Sarah and I are both pretty character-driven writers, and that the characters make the story, and you can't make the characters do things that aren't true to them, even though you're the one who made them up. But at a certain point, it's like, no, they wouldn't do that. And when you're trying to make a character do something for plot purposes, it just will not work.
And readers would hate that. But I mean, that's, with psychology, building that character and knowing them so well as you're writing, you know what they would do, what would work for them. And if you want them to do something that might seem out of character, you've got to really justify that. You've got to go back and rethink their character. In terms of draft, I tend to edit as I go and massage and rewrite as I go. So by the time I finish the first draft, it's usually that's what I turn in.
No one's ever seen one of my first drafts. For me, it feels like that old gym exercise of running ladders. I'll get as far in as I can, and then I'll go back to the beginning. And then I'll run a little farther next time and come back to the beginning. And then maybe around the third draft, I'll actually get to the end. But then I'll still have a couple of more drafts. I just revise and revise and revise. And I love revision though. That's the thing. That's my favorite part. When I've got a bunch of words on paper, I'm like, okay, now I know I'm going to actually write a novel. And it's the blank page that just terrifies me.
That is the worst thing. It's a blank page.
Do we have another question back here?
Just for Laura, you said you grew up loving James M. Cain. What would you say is your favorite James M. Cain novel?
Mildred Pierce. Mildred Pierce, hands down. The book doesn't have a murder in it. I actually have come to, I used to be one of those people who walked around saying, oh, the Joan Crawford version of Mildred Pierce, it's so different from the book. I don't like it. And I was also like, The Postman Always Rings Twice. It's so different. And there have been attempts to make more word faithful adaptations of both Mildred Pierce and The Postman Always Rings Twice. And I have actually gone back to having a lot of admiration for the earlier films and seeing what their values are. But Mildred Pierce is just such an odd book. It's about a woman who will do anything for the love of her daughter. And her daughter is a snake, and it's horrible, but it doesn't have super high stakes. It doesn't, it's not life or death. It's so interesting. So yeah, I probably read it once a year. And I quote it a lot because there's a line in there where Mildred makes a pie. She's actually trying to soften up her ex-husband to help her out with something, and she makes this pie. And James Cain says it was as commercially viable as a hand-whittled clothespin. And I just love that. I just like, like sometimes I talk about, certain things in my life as being as commercially viable as a hand-whittled clothespin. The novel, for example.
Any other questions?
Hi, great to meet both of you. I had the chance and privilege to see you a couple times, Laura. The first time my friend said, "Hey, Laura Lippman's in town," at the Books A Million several years ago in this area out on 22. I don't know if you guys
I think
did
I remember
any of
that.
you go to that? It's
Yeah.
a while ago. I wasn't familiar with your work, and I heard your words, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" And you were writing about Baltimore. By the way, Orioles fan.
Oh,
Can you believe? I mean, yeah,
we can get into all the superstitious rituals that I'm going through right now.
exactly. I wanted to just thank you for your writing. It's really captivating. I had a question for both of you. I wanted to know what was the most challenging thing for you in terms of your writing process. Is it the characters? Is it the dialogue? Is it the plot? Is it the discussion? And then I had a separate question for Sarah. I know you both were in the newsroom. I was curious if you ever done broadcast because you have such a broadcast voice. Just curious.
So I have a theory that we become good at the thing that we have to work the hardest at. Like if you come to writing and you think you're pretty good at A or B, but you're gonna have to work at C, then you work really hard at C and you become a lot better at that. So I came into crime writing thinking I can do character, I can do dialogue. I felt overwhelmed by plotting, and I have worked very, very, very hard on plotting, and I think that's where I've actually, shown the most improvement. And I think I'm kind of good at it. I'm like,
I'm surprised because your plots are very strong.
but I think it's because I work hard at it.
Yeah,
Because it's like I know
it's
that
a
that's.
challenge, and that's where you feel the weakest, so you want to conquer it. I get it.
What about
Thank
you,
you.
Sarah?
I would say actually early on that plotting was my biggest challenge too. My stories didn't have enough tension. And luckily there are a lot of resources for writers. And I read every book I could, took, classes. I continue to study the craft. So I really think it is a craft. There's no muse, there's no magic, it's carpentry. So yeah, I think the lack of tension, maybe my books felt a little more timid early on, and kind of leaning into that conflict was something I really needed to learn. Thank you. No, I have never done anything in broadcast. No, I did once a piece for NPR. And I remember I was so nervous I had to record it like 12 times. And they were like so particular about it. They're like, "Oh, we could hear you swallow, we could hear your, stomach rumble." And that was it. I like fled the office traumatized about all my noises and haven't gone back.
We do have time for another question.
Laura, I'm from Baltimore County, and I wanted to ask why you chose to have these characters be graduates of Towson High School, because I am a graduate of Towson High School and I teach at Towson High School.
It was probably pretty unfair to Towson High School to give them Joe and Amber.
Oh, Joe fits in really well.
I mean, it just seemed geographically appropriate. And I was kind of, I mean, I think I literally just looked at, I knew I wanted Joe and Amber to live. And I think I'm correct that area would have fed into Towson High School in the 90s. I was really interested in the area. For those of you who know Baltimore, for those of you who don't, the boy who's kind of the all-American hero lacrosse player lives in a neighborhood in Baltimore called Stoneleigh, which is just a very particular, beautiful neighborhood that I would say that people in Stoneleigh tend to hold their neighborhood in very high regard.
Oh, yes.
And then there's this street that runs along the southern part of it, Register. And Register is actually, my sister lives on Register,
Okay.
but toward Loch Raven.
Mhm.
So the house that I describe with all the weird ceramic stuff was actually based on a real part of Towson.
Okay, because I was thinking of the house in Kenilworth.
That's the
Yeah.
one. I actually, that's the one. I profiled that guy when I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and I was in the Baltimore County Bureau. Everybody knew that house.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I will say that I really did feel about it the way Amber felt about her stepfather's house, which is it was a kind of art installation.
Uh-huh.
And I really thought it was kind of beautiful. And to me, it's a grace note
Mhm.
that her stepfather, this man who's so quiet and has to die and leave her all his money before she even knows that he likes her that much, but that he has this, very peculiar, but very sweet hobby
Mhm.
of decorating his yard with these ceramic geese. And they have costumes. It's like, they celebrate Halloween, they celebrate Easter, 4th of July. But yeah, it's really funny that the house on
Oh, yeah. I
It's-
used to drive past it on purpose.
and it's gone
on
now.
my way home.
It's gone
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
And it's sort of like you wonder, I mean, I
Mhm.
have a feeling he's gone, but I think anyone who knows that house on Kenilworth thinks about it every
Yeah.
time. But yeah,
Mhm.
just that I really wanted to use kind of that tension between Stoneleigh and not Stoneleigh.
Yes.
Which
Oh,
is
just like your degrees of removal from the center of it.
yeah.
And just all of the socioeconomic implications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I just think the name Chumley is really
It's
funny.
wonderful, isn't it?
The fact that people lived on Chumley.
I think that's all the time we have for tonight. So let's give another hand for Laura and Sarah.
You guys.
If you haven't yet, be sure to pick up a copy of the book and stick around to have it signed. Thank you so much.